The new look Philadelphia 76ers are scary for the rest of the league. Ever since the Sixers traded for James Harden in this small sample size, Philadelphia has looked unstoppable. The pick and roll / pick and pop with Joel Embiid and James Harden has been lethal. But quickly before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm Juicy Sports, I make opinionated NBA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. But anyways, let's get into it.
Oh yeah, I work with the medics. I'm about to get you injected. I got a couple connections so I can get you prosthetics.
At the beginning of the season, the Philadelphia 76ers were in turmoil. Not a lot of people thought the Sixers had any chance in winning the championship this season if they didn't figure out the Ben Simmons issue, and there was only one of two ways they could have went about solving that issue. Of course, option A, which would have been the easiest solution, would be Ben Simmons just come back to Philadelphia, and if he played well enough, of course the Sixers certainly had a chance to win a championship this season, but of course that didn't happen, and option 2 ended up happening, where the Sixers just ended up trading away Ben Simmons in return for some assets, and the assets that they bring in return for Ben would help them win a championship. And of course, as we all know, a little bit ago at this point, the Philadelphia 76ers ended up trading for James Harden, and at the time of the trade, I made a video on it saying that this was an absolutely perfect fit for the Sixers, and the pick and roll / pick and pop of both Joel Embiid and James Harden would be absolutely lethal for the rest of the NBA. And I know it's only been a few games, 2 or 3 games, but so far early on, it really has been lethal for the rest of the NBA, and basically all the teams that they played so far, although they haven't been great teams, had absolutely no answers for that. But I think overall, even besides the pick and roll / pick and pop with those two guys, I think the addition of James Harden to this team is an absolutely perfect fit in general. But why do I personally think that this fit is so good in Philadelphia for James Harden? Let's quickly go over that. Now, the first reason is pretty obvious. It's the fact that they have Joel Embiid on this team. And even besides the pick and pop and pick and roll between these two guys, just the fact that Joel Embiid is on the court is going to take a ton of pressure away from James Harden, and vice versa, the fact that Harden is on the court is going to take a lot of pressure off Embiid. And both of these guys are going to be able to get a lot more one-on-one opportunities when the other player's on the court. Now, you can easily say that the same situation applies when James Harden was playing in Brooklyn, which is completely accurate, but I think the big issue with James Harden playing with those other guys in KD and Kyrie was the fact that James wasn't getting the ball in his hands most of the time like he was getting in Houston. And I think playing in Philadelphia is going to be a happy medium between the two, because the fact that Joel Embiid is obviously not a point guard and is not going to dribble the ball up the court would give James Harden the ability to have the ball in his hands most of the time and run the offense through him, while at the same time also playing with another superstar like Joel who can take a ton of pressure off James Harden. And I think it's just a great medium. Now, the next reason why I think James is such a perfect fit in Philly is due to his defense. Now, it's been pretty clear throughout the most part of James's career, he's never been known as a good defender, and early on in his Houston days, he was actually known as a horrific defender. And I will say over the past few seasons, James has certainly gotten much better defensively, but even at this point, James Harden is certainly not known as a great defender, or even a good defender, of course. And of course, in Brooklyn, one of their biggest issues was defense, and having a guy like James Harden on your team is certainly not going to help your defensive issues out. But now talking about James in Philadelphia, I think it would be a much better fit because James Harden doesn't necessarily need to be a great defender. Philadelphia was always known as being one of the better defensive teams in the NBA, especially when you look at guys, of course, Joel Embiid. Tobias Harris is a pretty good defender. Matisse Thybulle is a fantastic defender, maybe the best defender in the NBA. Danny Green's a really good defender as well. And overall, the Sixers just do a fantastic job at playing great team defense besides their great individual defenders. And I think James would have a much easier time playing defense in Philly than he did in Brooklyn prior. And those are all the reasons for why I think James Harden fits in with the Sixers perfectly. But now let's talk about the other side. Let's talk about how the Sixers benefit from adding James to their team. So of course we all know James Harden has the ability and capability of putting up 40 on any given night. And he also has the ability to do so in many different ways as well. Of course, he can cook from that 3-point range with those step back 3-point shots. He has a decent mid-range shot that he can use when he wants to. He has a nice floater within his game. Of course, can drive all the way to the basket, runs the pick and roll / pick and pop very effectively, as I mentioned before. And overall, in terms of his individual scoring, James Harden is certainly one of the best individual scorers we have in the NBA. And of course, due to that fact, his teammates' lives are now going to be a lot easier, because now a guy like Tobias Harris, instead of being the second option in Philadelphia, is going to be the third option, and Tyrese Maxey, instead of being the third, is going to be the fourth, or maybe you can reverse those two guys. Tyrese has been improving very significantly this season, but either way, everybody's lives on that roster is going to be much easier for having James on that team, of course. But of course, besides James being a fantastic individual scorer, he also has a fantastic ability to pass and play make. Besides the pick and roll and pick and pop with Embiid, as I was talking about before, James also has the ability to drive all the way to the basket and kick out all the way to a wide open catch and shoot 3-point shooter, also having the ability to get a rebound on one side and quickly chuck the ball to the other side of the court for an easy dunk or layup for one of his teammates. He always sees the floor very well, and whenever a team cuts back door, he's most likely going to find that teammate. And overall, James just does a fantastic job as a traditional point guard, and certainly has all the abilities as a traditional point guard would. And overall, even though Philadelphia needed to give up a few players that really helped them out, especially a guy in Seth Curry, who was a big part of what they do, I still think the trade was certainly a great trade for the Sixers, and adding James Harden to this team is just such a perfect fit for Philly. But of course, this James Harden trade wouldn't be successful for the Sixers if they don't win an NBA championship within the next 2 seasons or so. So let's actually look at their chances to win the championship this year. So just looking around the Eastern Conference for some potential contenders, I think teams like the Boston Celtics, Cleveland Cavaliers, Toronto Raptors, Atlanta Hawks, Charlotte Hornets, I think all those teams, the Sixers would have a pretty easy job at beating those teams, honestly, and maybe it might come as a little bit of a surprise when I say the Cleveland Cavaliers. My reasoning behind that is, of course, the Cavs certainly have had a great season this year, but the only reason why I say that is I think the combo of James Harden and Joel Embiid would just be way too much, especially come playoff time, and also considering that most of the players on the Cavs have never been to the playoffs and are relatively young guys. But of course, at the same time, I could be wrong. Obviously, maybe they would do very well against the Sixers, but in my opinion, all those teams that I mentioned in the East, the Sixers would have a relatively easy time with. Other teams like the Miami Heat, Chicago Bulls, Milwaukee Bucks, Brooklyn Nets, I think all those teams would be much more difficult for the Sixers to beat, but at the same time, I honestly could see the Sixers beating all of those teams. I think the Sixers have a perfect combination of two very high-level superstars at the top, as well as a relatively well-balanced roster for the most part, along with the fact that they also play fantastic defense, and for all those reasons, I certainly think the Sixers have the capability to make it out of the Eastern Conference. But looking at the Western Conference, I think there's a ton of great teams in the West, but honestly, I think it really only comes down to 2 teams that could easily make it out of the Western Conference, at least in my opinion, and those teams are, of course, the Phoenix Suns and Golden State Warriors. And honestly, I think the drop-off between the Warriors and the Memphis Grizzlies, who may be in 3rd place in that race, is pretty significant, at least in my opinion. But matching the Sixers up to both of those teams, of course, I do think the Sixers have enough talent to beat both of those teams, but at the same time, I do think both Golden State and Phoenix would be a much tougher matchup for the Sixers, as opposed to basically any team in the Eastern Conference, at least in my opinion. But we'll see what happens going forward for Philadelphia. I don't necessarily have the Sixers as my personal pick to win the championship at this point, but at the same time, as I said before, I wouldn't be surprised if the Sixers did win whatsoever. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think the Sixers, especially after this James Harden trade, could win the championship this season, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these 2 videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out, guys.
Oh yeah, I work with the medics. I'm about to get you injected. I got a couple connections so I can get you prosthetic. Hope you can't go where I'm headed.